Hello everyone, my name is Animesh Roy. I have been teaching as an assistant professor in English at St. Xavier's College, Srinagar in India. It's wonderful to get an opportunity to speak on extraction, a relatively niche area in social and political ecology, as well as environmental humanities, that is continuously being subject to debate, discussion, and dialogue. I'll speak on literature, extraction, and the global south, and try to focus on how literature from the global south has responded to the issue of extraction. The lecture would seek to address how writings from the global south have served to highlight and globalize various voices of dissent against exploitation of the environment of the indigenous peoples residing in ostensibly remote places in the global south, which earlier remained unheard of or ignored both at the national as well as the global levels. Literature from the global south, especially Arundhati Roy's Walking with the Comrades, For the Greater Common God, Helen Havila's Oil on Water, and most importantly, Ken Saro-Wiwa's Genocide in Nigeria and A Month and a Day, focus on the concerns of the indigenous people over extraction and destruction of the lands, waters, forests, and local habitats through a joint plunder by the state and global neo-colonial forces. Their writings serve to explore the environmental justice movement of the indigenous people against the vicious nexus in natural resource extraction and its loot by a cartel composed of their own ruling elites and the transnational economic agents of neoliberalism. It therefore serves to give voices to the media marginalized causes of the indigenous people lacking in resources, those disenfranchised people who have been treated as disposable citizens fighting desperately for their existence as well as their environment. The issue dealt with in these texts does not remain limited to any particular geopolitical locale. Rather, they are symptomatic of a much larger crisis of an intensified environmental exploitation in the global south by a globalized ruling class whose economic interests are embodied in the labyrinthine world of speculative financial transactions. The global south as a critical category or a critical concept has variously and vigorously been defined and contested. It has traditionally been used to refer to economically disadvantaged nation states and as a post-Cold War alternative to the Third World. However, I would like to use Global South in a post-national sense to address spaces and people negatively impacted by capitalist globalization. Contemporary literary investigations about extraction and how extraction has been conducive in bringing about the Anthropocene, conjuring humans as the single transcendent villain responsible for the pernicious effect on planetary ecology, has moved toward the narrative of an undifferentiated anthropos, thereby absolving the erstwhile colonial powers within the global north of its complicity with the climate crisis. This is where it is important to bring in the history of the empire, colonialism, and neocolonialism. I take post-colonialism, or for the matter of fact neocolonialism, not as a sign of a distinct historical break between the era of modern Euro-North American colonial domination and that of Asian, African, Latin American, and Oceanic national self-determination, but rather as a historical condition of an intensified and sustained exploitation of the majority of humans and non-humans of the former colonies by a cartel composed of their own and core metropolitan European or North American elites. That is to say, the post-colonialism doesn't post-colonialism marks not an end of colonialism, but an end of a particular mode of colonialism, which then shifts its gears and evolves to another stage, triggering a concomitant shift in the global struggles against it. The globalized ruling classes of this post-colonialism in the global south, whose interests are often embodied in gigantic transnational corporations, and the labyrinthine world of speculative financial transactions are often called the new cosmopolitans. The body of literary texts, both fiction and non-fiction, from the countries of the global south, ride back against the world centers of political, cultural, and economic powers, articulating the intersections of nature, culture, and history from the perspective of the global south or post-colonial countries, which has faced the brunt of a colonized past and an uneven neoliberal capitalist development in the post-colonial times. Graham Hugan, in his book The Post-Colonial Exotic, accuses the post-colonial novel of banking on the global commodification of cultural differences that has capitalized on its perceived marginality while helping turn marginality itself into into a valuable intellectual commodity, and thereby helping in the extension and regulation of the neo-colonial market regime, which itself is an extension and a more intensified form of older colonial and imperial capitalist formations. Yet, as Hugan himself acknowledges subsequently, that the post colonial novel bites back, that the post colonial writer of the global south managed to find a way to critique their own sociological position in forms of cultivated exhibitionism that resides in their formal and stylistic qualities. The story of the post colonial novel, representing the general socio environmental condition of the global south, about the necessary interlinked devastation of humans, non humans, air, water, and soil, is experienced as a performance of the story, a disturbing experience that prevents any easy consumption of the story as merely another simple pleasure, a supping of the more exotic products of the world. Literature from the global south thus try to interrogate and subvert the often normative egalitarian northern literary representations of extraction and environment, in the process trying to ground and de-exoticize the reading of the environment of the south, thereby providing a just case to prove uh, uh, that the subalterns can indeed speak out. Though countries in the global south are segregated by different geographical locales, they are connected by the fact that they are the sites of an intensified environmental exploitation by a globalized ruling class and the resistant imaginary of a transnational political subject that results from a shared experience of subjugation under contemporary global capitalism. Both the text from the global south that I discuss here, be it Helen Havila's fiction Oil on Water or Arundhati Roy's non-fiction Walking with the Comrades, speak of capitalist extractions and the exploitation of the indigenous people of the area, which began during the colonial period and continues in this neo-colonial period supported by their nation states to affect the lives of the marginalized poor. Like Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Nigerian activists who protested against the environmental injustice in the Ogoniland due to oil drillings carried on by transnational oil corporations in collaboration with Nigeria's government, Havila's novel speaks of the environmental horrors faced by the indigenous communities in the Niger Delta, which, because of the oil drillings, had severe environmental and health consequences for the indigenous people living there. Arundhati Roy's Walking with the Comrades similarly explores the processes of oppression and impoverishment of the indigenous people in central India because of the extraction processes in the mineral rich areas by a cartel composed of the barons of big business and the political and economic elites. It's an account of the face off in the forests of central India between the Indian state and the Maoists or Naxalites, which are generally presumed to be a shadowy revolutionary guerrilla forces who battle over power, land, ideology, mineral riches, human rights, and ecology, a battle which Roy sees it as for the soul of India. Now, one of the common themes which both Havila and Roy explores about ecology extraction and the global south is how historically the extractive view rendered native population invisible, which legally rendered the settlement of foreign populations onto communal properties and facilitated the taking of their territories' resources for resource extraction. European colonization throughout the world cast nature as the other, and through the gaze of terra nullis or empty spaces, represented indigenous people as non existent, a colonial gaze that not only continues to inform and reinform people's ideas about new frontiers to be explored for for extractive capitalism, but has often been used as a tool in acquiring newer lands in this neo-colonial period. But the extractive region, be it the Niger Delta or the dense forest of central India, was not terra nullis but inhabited by indigenous peoples since hundreds and even thousands of years, and the indigenous people shared their own organic relationship to the area. As Ken Saro-Wiwa argues in his Genocide in Nigeria, that to the Ogonis, rivers and streams do not only provide water for life, for bathing, drinking. They do not only provide fish for food, they are also sacred and are bound up intricately with the life of the community, of the entire Ogoni nation. The people living in these areas for hundreds of years were forcefully relocated to other areas for what they were called as the progress and development of their country. If extractive capitalism reorganized space and time, then vertical seeing normalized violent removal. By continuing to rupture indigenous cosmological relationships to land, as both Havila and Roy argues, the state and corporations expand their control and purview over nature in new forms of geographical colonialism, even in post-independent period under what is known as the new elites of their countries. This is how colonial visual regimes initiated during colonial period continue to normalize an extractive planetary view that continues to facilitate capitalist expansion, especially upon resource-rich indigenous territories. Apart from the spectacular violence associated with extractive capitalism, what both Havila and Roy proposes is what Rob Nixon calls the slow violence, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Crucially, slow violence is often not just attritional but also exponential, operating as a major threat multiplier. It can fuel long-term proliferating conflicts in situations where the conditions for sustaining life become increasingly but gradually degraded. The long-term slow violence initiated during the colonial period, both in the Niger Delta as well as in the mines of central India, and later on continued in the post-colonial period by the joint collaboration of transnational corporations and the governments, led to what Saru Wiwa calls as the ecological genocide. The struggle of the indigenous people with toxins released from the numerous oil drilling stations in Niger Delta and the mines of central India should be considered not only as a contest over space and natural resources, but also over time, due to the fact that such violence is not only slow-paced and delayed in its effect, but rather it often multiplies the threat on a long-term basis through biological magnification and toxic drift, engendering engendering effects in such ways that sustaining life becomes slowly but increasingly difficult. And it is most often people lacking in resources, be it the Ogonis in Niger Delta or the tribals of central India, those marginalized who have been made almost socially and politically invisible as a consequence of the poverty, who are the principal casualties of slow violence. Such threats caused by slow violence, as both Havila and Roy argues, is not only ecological but also physical. For in the long term, their human body serve as the loci of accretion, sites where chemicals interact and build over time, producing new forms and unknown reactions. A corollary to the idea of slow violence is the notion of environmental racism. Environmental racism is broadly or generally defined as the connection in theory and practice of race and the environment, so that the oppression of one is connected to and supported by the oppression of the other. Environmental racism tries to study the experience of communities that struggle daily with environmental degradation and with their disenfranchisement from the institutions and structures that control their living environment, besides casting a critical eye on the political economy of environmental degradation, including the structure of environmental decision making in disaffected communities. Both Oil and Water by Havila and Walking with the Comrades by Roy, tries to explore the realities of the form of displacement, which Nixon calls displacement without moving, a process that, instead of referring solely to the movement of people from their places of belonging, refers rather to the loss of the land and resources beneath them, a loss that leaves communities stranded in a place stripped of the very characteristics that made it inhabitable. The loss of the land, the knowledge systems which helped people to sustain themselves in that part of the land, became dysfunctional, rendering it impossible for the people, both culturally and economically, to sustain their life even in other parts of the world. It is a fact that the extractive economy in the Niger Delta or in central India is structured in such a way, uh, not only Niger Delta or central India, but in fact the entire global south. Uh, the extractive economy is structured in such a way that the people residing in the resource exploitation area rarely receive any benefit. On the contrary, their land uh, is continuously being despoiled as a result of pollution. Uh, both Habila, both Habila in Oil on Water and Roy in Walking with the Comrades uh, indicates one significant issue related to extraction, ecology, and the global south, and that is how the narratives of belonging and ownership of natural resources are reshaping the politics of claim making in many communities in the Niger Delta and central India, and how the politics of claim making is reshaping in turn the politics of belonging. The larger picture, which both Habida and Roy wants the reader to focus, is the reality of the terrorization of not only the landscape but also its people by the transnational companies working in joint cohorts with the state. Both Habila and Roy's writings indeed show how the indigenous people are treated very much as dispensable. Both Habila and Roy thereby introduces an argument about the propriety of the use of violence in the struggle for environmental justice. They show how, on the one hand, there is the environmental violence on an epic scale unleashed by the transnational extractive companies on the landscape and its people, the killing of the indigenous people in an unconventional way, as Ken Saro-Wiwa puts it, by environmental means. On the other hand, there is also the violence used by the state army on the local communities to protect the commercial interests of the extraction companies. This vicious nexus between the state and the transnational companies, with the oil companies, with the mining companies across the global south, are all part of what is popularly called as the militarization of commerce. Such an argument becomes explicit in the representations by Habil and Roy. As a result of the use of such violence by the local indigenous community, against the local indigenous community, the local indigenous community protested, and often through violent means. And because of such use of violence by the locals, they have often been labeled as militants or hostage takers. Both Habil and Roy's discourse on the reality of extractive capitalism in the Niger Delta and the mineral-rich mines of central India thus calls for redefining and thereby to debate afresh and discuss about the whole idea of protest and militancy. The oil companies or the mining companies working in collusion with the state thus becomes, according to Habil and Roy, no less a hostage taker and militant, because it is they who have taken the environment and the people of the extractive landscape hostage. These are in brief. I tried to chalk out the basic uh, features, basic points of literature, extraction, and the global south. I saw extraction with reference to the global south and how they are reflected in literature from the global south. Hopefully, we'll be working it out in details in the paper later on. Thank you.